Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, April the 24th, 2024. So it may be Happy Birthday Ireland. So you could argue that today is Ireland's 108th birthday. Now, that is controversial because there is an argument about what constitutes the beginning of a country. And I have kind of had these arguments, I think, with some commenters to my videos. And, do you take a legalistic beginning, when a country, for example, becomes formally independent? Or do you take an inspirational beginning, even if at the time of this inspirational beginning there is no independence whatsoever? For example, you take the American Declaration of Independence, July the 4th, 1776, I believe at 10 past 5 in the afternoon. Now, at that time, the American colonists controlled pretty much nothing. It was controlled by, the whole thing, the colonies were controlled by Britain, yet most astrologers take that date as the beginning of American independence, the beginning of America. And that chart for July the 4th, 1776 works very well. Now, in the case of Ireland, today is the 108th anniversary of the Easter Rising on April the 24th, 1916. There was a rebellion in Dublin, I think in other places, but mainly in Dublin, and it achieved some early success. It seized the General Post Office, and at 12:45, Patrick Pearse proclaimed, I think, an independent republic. Now, that rebellion was completely crushed. Patrick Pearse and many others were executed. So you could say, well, that you can't really take that as the beginning of the country, can you? You have to wait until, I don't know, there was a civil war and Ireland had a treaty, or go further still, you might have to wait until 1949 when Ireland was totally independent of Britain. So you could take those dates, but I just feel that the inspiration for the event, that spark, is incredibly important and is going to be relevant to that country's history and development. I was only really thinking about this last night, so I haven't done a lot of research on it, any research at all. So I'm still going to look at that chart with 12:45. I got that time 12:45 from an RTE, I think that's the Irish public news site, for the timing of the Proclamation of Independence. So was it on rte.ie, and somewhere on their website I found this site. So I'm quite relatively comfortable with that 12:45 time. And I don't have any really real events to compare it against except one. I've gone for an early event. I've compared it with the assassination of Michael Collins, which happened in August 1922. Just seeing, because the assassination of Michael Collins was, I think, for the Irish, was a very traumatic event. And so I wanted to take one of the first traumatic events in Ireland's history and sort of compare it with the chart of the proclamation of Ireland's independence on Easter Monday, I think it was, Easter Monday 1916, April the 24th. Now, that's a controversial view of Ireland. I think it's controversial, but I just wanted to explore that date, especially as it is April the 24th. And we shouldn't forget that traditionally, Ireland is a Taurean country. After all, it's the Emerald Isle. And William Lilly, in his 17th century book, Christian Astrology, when you go through the signs and you look at which countries cover each sign, he makes it clear that Ireland is connected to Taurus. And so it's appropriate that the Easter uprising happened when the sun was in Taurus, at, I think around 3 Taurus. So that's the first thing I want to look at. Another event I want to look at is the Armenian Genocide. Yes, that's another thing that are not so, I suppose the anniversary of the Easter uprising is somewhat tragic. The British really messed things up by executing the ringleaders. I think if they hadn't have executed them, it wouldn't have been such an important day, and Ireland probably would have had its independence much later. But by executing the ringleaders, the British really into executions. In the old days they used to be, but they'd be very legalistic about it. They would. If it doesn't matter about the situation, you've got to follow the law. You've got to execute them. That was sort of standard British approach, and so that was in a way tragic, but for the Irish, it is very inspirational. But the Armenian Genocide, which started on April the 24th, 1915, when one particular man, I think his name was Talim Pasha, ordered a roundup of Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul, it used to be called Constantinople, and that marked the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. So I did want to look at that chart. And also the chart of the man who was responsible for it. Sorry, not Talim Pasha, Talat Pasha, forgive me, Talat Pasha. And finally, maybe on a lighter note, no, perhaps not on a much lighter note, is the horoscope of a woman called Paula Yates. Now, Paula Yates would have had her birthday today. She was born on April the 24th, 1959. She died of a heroin overdose in September 2000. But as would have been her 65th birthday, I thought it might be a good idea to look at her chart. So Paula Yates, in the sort of 90s, late 20th century, she was a very big television personality, famous for being married to Bob Geldof. Then she was associated with Michael Hutchence, and she had these sort of television series. She would interview people on a bed, and she was sort of part of that sort of beginning of maybe reality TV. I suppose there's something, I don't know, it's not quite reality TV, but sort of interviewing someone on a bed she was sort of being very seductive about it by interviewing her guests on a bed. I don't know, that was maybe very much about the 90s in the UK. That kind of thing was, it really fitted the era, I think. But you may not have heard of Paula Yates, but still, I want to talk about it. Another thing about Paula Yates is she found out very late who her real father was. Her father was assumed to be, I think, someone called Jess Yates, and then it was later discovered that her father was, after DNA testing, was a man called Huey Green. Huey Green was a big television personality in the sort of 60s and 70s, and he had this show Opportunity Knocks about, I think it was a show for finding talent, and so she discovered who her father was, and the whole world found out who her father was. It wasn't just that she found out that her father was not who she thought he was, but the whole world found out not the whole world, Britain mattered, that her father was actually someone who was also super famous. Okay, he may not be particularly famous now, but in the 90s, Huey Green was still someone who people in the UK had mainly heard of. So that's what I want to discuss today. But before I do all that, I want to look at the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Wednesday, April the 24th, 2024. There we have. So we have obviously the Irish flag top right. That is Paula Yates. Bottom left, that's Michael Collins, who the Irish leader who was assassinated in 1922, and I just want to look at his the chart of the assassination and compare it with the chart for the proclamation of Ireland's independence. And bottom right, that is Talat Pasha. So what is going on today? Well, today it's another day when we have to consider the full moon. The full moon is still very much around. Now, if you're in the Americas, the full moon was yesterday. If you're in London, it would be at, I think, 0:49 in the morning, just 49 minutes after midnight. If you're in London or Paris, if you're in Paris or Rome, it would be 1:49 a.m. If you're in India, it would be sort of early morning, after sunrise, I think, around the time of sunrise. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, then it might not be until almost lunchtime, depending on where you are. Very late morning, lunchtime, early lunchtime, that's when the full moon will happen. So it kind of depends on your time zone. But today is still very much a full moon day, and we still have to consider everything about that full moon. The idea that we got the moon in Scorpio, the sun in Taurus, and it's a time when we start to understand the truth, or some of us might. If we're using the energies of a full moon correctly, we will be understanding the truth. We can start to see things as they are, with all the lies and delusions hopefully being stripped away. And that might have a connection to relationships. It might also be connected to ourselves and our feelings and who we are. And this full moon could be somewhat difficult. It is a problem full moon. The moon does not work very well in Scorpio. Every year we have a Scorpio full moon, and almost always we only have one Scorpio full moon. I think it's possible to have two Scorpio full moons. If you had a full moon right at the beginning, just as the sun was going into Taurus and just before it left into Gemini, you could in theory have two Scorpio full moons, but usually we just get one. And this is the Scorpio full moon for 2024. And the moon is under pressure. And for some of us, it may be difficult to express ourselves. We might just be keeping a lot secret and be perhaps wallowing in our emotions, and we perhaps have to somehow get round that. But there is a constructive side to this full moon, and this full moon is, the moon is now past full for most of us now. It's not a build up to a full moon. The moon itself, the full moon itself, was at 4 Scorpio. This chart, which is set for noon, April 24th, 2024 in New York, the moon is at 12:34 Scorpio. It's starting to make a trine to Saturn. And so that trine to Saturn may actually create a little bit of stability. Some of the chaos of the last day or two may be starting to dissipate. And at the same time, the moon is moving out of the Via Combusta. If you're in New York, for example, off the top of my head, the moon will move out of the Via Combusta sort of late afternoon. If you're in Europe, it'll be into tomorrow. But when the moon moves out of the Via Combusta, there is a certain sense in which things are returning to normal. Because the Via Combusta, this period when the moon is between 15 Libra and 15 Scorpio, can be somewhat troublesome, and things might not work to plan. And when the moon leaves the Via Combusta, when it moves into late Scorpio, and in this case, yes, it's making a trine to Saturn, there can be more stability and as I've said, a certain sense that things are returning to normal. And actually, in terms of main aspects, Moon trine Saturn is really the only thing going on apart from the full moon. So aspect-wise, today is actually quite light. There are a couple of minor aspects, deciles to be precise. There is a decile between the Sun and Neptune. They're 36 degrees apart. There's also a decile between Mercury and Uranus. So deciles are about the struggle to bring out what's in our mind. Can be about style, but we have an idea. How do we bring it out? And so Sun decile Neptune. Perhaps it's the struggle to find transcendence in the way we relate to the world. Perhaps some of us feel that the world as it is just somehow a little bit tedious and two-dimensional. We know it's all going to end at some stage, and we would like it to be a little more spiritual, a little more meaningful, and perhaps some of us will feel this struggle to make our world more meaningful and transcendental, perhaps. We want to see perhaps the spirituality in everything we do, in the whole way we express ourselves, but it can be a struggle to bring that inner spirituality out there into the world in which we live. Additionally, there is a decile between Mercury and Uranus. So again, a certain feeling that the world on its own is just a little bit boring. Same old things, same old way. We just feel we want to stir things up, perhaps through our actions, perhaps through our words. Well, particularly our words, it's Mercury. So we've got these ideas, but we want to make an impact. And so we might struggle to make an impact. In the process, though, we may be a little bit too hasty. And from a heliocentric point of view, again, I'm not saying that anything is happening when we look at the world from a heliocentric perspective, but I just do feel that as a matter of form, every single day we should just look at the heliocentric solar system, where we put the sun in the middle, where it should be, just so we can keep track of things. And I have not looked at this chart beforehand. So this is the heliocentric position. We can see that Mercury is sextile Pluto. Remember, this is a heliocentric chart. From a heliocentric perspective, Mercury does not go retrograde. Nothing goes retrograde in a heliocentric chart. So Mercury sextile Pluto does indicate perhaps our desire to have an influence. Perhaps it links up with Mercury decile Uranus from a geocentric perspective. So people are trying to have an influence in a gentle way, perhaps, because it's a sextile. But when you see Mercury Pluto aspects, you can think perhaps in terms of propaganda, people trying to assert themselves mentally. But I do think it's gentle, and we may not actually notice things. Now, another sextile which is starting to form, that maybe we should be aware of as it starts to form, we can see Jupiter is at 26 Taurus, and Neptune is at 27-36 Pisces. So Jupiter is starting to move towards a sextile to Neptune. We can see a geocentric corollary of that. Geocentrically, Jupiter in Taurus is moving towards a sextile to Neptune in Pisces. It's slow. It's getting there. So the outer planets heliocentrically tend to be pretty close to where they are geocentrically. So yes, the Jupiter-Neptune sextile is starting to form. People are starting to be optimistic about certain things, but very often that optimism is based on really nothing. It can be just plain fantasy, but we'll go into that later. Oh, one other thing. Neptune is making a semi-sextile to Mars. So Neptune semi-sextile Mars can be about action which maybe is going nowhere, or from a broader point of view, from a broader global perspective, it might be about some form of contamination, industrial spills, for example. We have to be careful with chemicals, alcohol, drugs, with Mercury making a semi-sextile to Neptune, because if things can go wrong, perhaps they will go wrong when it comes to chemicals. And Saturn is actually on the midpoint of Mars and Saturn. That is past its peak, though, that Saturn on the Mars-Neptune. So there is the possibility of making mistakes with chemicals, and also just applying power in the wrong way and pretty quickly realizing it is the wrong way, and the mistakes start to pile up. That is my view on what's going on heliocentrically. I must emphasize, when I look at the solar system from a heliocentric perspective, so far I have not been doing a lot of preparation on this. I'm just telling you what I see. And there are other things I should be considering when looking at the heliocentric positions, for example, the planetary nodes. But maybe I will start to look at that pretty soon. Let me now consider the 12 signs. So as I usually do, I'm going to do my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Wednesday, April the 24th, 2024. Aries, you are starting to feel quite emotional. I mean, I don't mean emotional in a sort of hysterical way. It's just you can feel the power of your own feelings and your emotions and the past, and it's weighing in on you. And I think to a great extent that is connected with the full moon. You understand, Aries, that things are complicated, and you may be tempted to make them overcomplicated, because Aries as a sign is about taking the initiative, being the one that makes things happen. And so today, with this full moon, we had this full moon yesterday as well, with this full moon, the normal Aries ways of functioning just aren't really working properly, and you're having to adopt a different approach, and it doesn't feel comfortable. And I would suggest, Aries, that you just stay with it, and you start to get a sense of your own strength working in different ways. Because I'm not actually saying you're in a weak position. You're not in a weak position at all. You're just having to get used to a different way of being, and you have to just be more focused on your feelings, and perhaps what you need to do is to be able to harness them. And in the process, a lot of that is about being patient. Things cannot happen as quickly as you'd like. If you were to try to force the pace, then I think very quickly you would hit a brick wall, or rather you'd hit sludge. Like I don't know, walking through a field with, mud up to your shins. It's just hard work. Yeah, sure, you could get across the field, but is it really worth it? It might be best to just stay where you are and try to just understand where you are. Nothing has to be done. And if you stay still, you're giving yourself an opportunity for everything to sink in. Now, later on, you can get back to your normal self. But just right now, just let everything develop in its own way. And don't listen too hard to what other people are saying. And don't pick up too much from other people's feelings. Yes, people have feelings, and you're picking up on those feelings. But just don't respond. Just let it all wash over you. But I should say, though, that there are a couple of people who are very influential, very persuasive. They are able, perhaps, to get through to you. Perhaps they'll try to change your mind about something. You can certainly listen, but I wouldn't be overly influenced by them. I know that Aries regards itself as being a strong independent sign, and it is a strong independent sign, but there is a gateway for you to be influenced by an outside force. I'm not saying that influence is necessarily bad, but it's something that needs to be avoided. If you allow yourself to be influenced, perhaps the influence might work like this, is that Aries is a fire sign. And so when everything is exciting, moving, you've got the spark, you're in your element. What you don't want to do is move onto someone else's territory. So if you are involved in a situation that is overly emotional, remembering the moon is in Scorpio, you are somewhat out of your element. And because you're out of the element, there is an element there. Well, there is not an element of vulnerability. There is vulnerability. There's vulnerability to being persuaded about something that isn't necessarily very healthy. So I won't say stand firm, because you do have to be flexible today, and you have to sort of let the emotions and feelings and the vibes wash over you. But just take what people say with a pinch of salt, and remember you're an Aries and your independence is very important to you. Taurus, you can be quite convincing today. And I think it's because you're able to understand people. You understand what's going on. Sometimes Taurians can make the mistake of focusing too much on surface appearances, material surface appearances, and they don't understand what's happening deep down. But today, I think you have a good understanding of what is happening, and I think you're helped by the full moon. Sun in Taurus, opposition the moon in Scorpio. Sun in Taurus, that perhaps represents you being grounded, looking at the way things are in a material sense, but at the same time being challenged to look at the emotional side of things, the deeper side of people's motivations and their fears, and everything that just makes them tick and breathe on an emotional level. And I think you get it. And because of this, you are actually in quite a powerful position. And when I was talking to Aries, I was warning Aries that Aries should perhaps avoid people who are overly persuasive. Who are these persuasive people? Well, perhaps they're people like you, because actually today you can be very persuasive if you give it a go. if you want people to believe something or to accept something or to maybe do something, you'll know what to say. And it's not just about saying, it's about what you don't say. It's about your body language. It's about the whole way you carry yourself. And so, Taurus, I think today you can be persuasive, and you do have to ask yourself whether it's the right thing to do. You have to consider that. You mustn't, Taurus, just take the view that the ends always justify the means. Taurus can do that. Perhaps Taurus at its worst can just have a set of goals and think, we have to achieve these goals, and it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter who gets hurt. We've got to achieve this goal. It doesn't matter what lies I tell. It doesn't matter how much I deceive people. It's all for the greater good. You don't want to fall into that trap, I don't think. But in certain cases, it can be a good idea to persuade people if you are right, and it's not just about your ego, and you're not being completely dogmatic. Using your persuasive abilities may be something that you should do. Just make sure that you do it within some limits. Turning to relationships, there is a full moon. We can't deny this. There was the full moon, perhaps you felt it yesterday, today. It kind of depends on your time zone. But the full moon is here, very much here. And this full moon hits the main axis of your chart, Sun in Taurus, Moon in Scorpio. And full moons are often about awareness and an understanding of something, seeing the truth of the matter, finally. And in terms of relationships, all those various one-to-one relationships you might be involved in, you start to understand their truth. You understand what the other person really is, and you start to understand the dynamic of a relationship. And because of that realization, you're in a position to make choices. Do you want to continue with a relationship? Do you want to end the relationship? Do you want to make the relationship stronger? What is the real nature of the person you're having a relationship with? So these are the kind of thoughts that you should perhaps be having. You don't have to make any dramatic decisions today or do anything, take immediate action. And you do have to remember that astrology is but just one side of things. There are other ways of evaluating a relationship. But do consider that full moon. And from a positive note, the moon, while moving through Scorpio, starts making a trine to Saturn. That's particularly the case if you're in the Americas. If you're not in the Americas, that may be sort of more late in the day or even tomorrow. But the moon is making a trine to Saturn, and this gives you the ability to stabilize certain relationships. So if a relationship matters, and perhaps it's been a bit chaotic or hasn't perhaps gone in the way you'd like, but you still regard the relationship as important, you can take gentle action to stabilize things. Gemini. Mercury is very soon going to be direct. It will be kind of slowing down to a halt in preparation for its direct motion, which I think it's tomorrow that Mercury goes stationary direct. So I think that is something certainly to be looking forward to, and it's perhaps a time when you should be considering a certain amount of preparation. Perhaps if things haven't been working out recently, the last few weeks, or things have been delayed, you might have been quite frustrated, but you can start preparing in many cases for the move, where things are finally going to start to work. So don't despair if things seem to be really slow at the moment, because it's nearly over. Mercury is very soon going to be direct. And I think, Gemini, you really are thinking that now is the time. you've got something to do. You really have got something to do, and you want to make change in the world out there, not just in your head. I mean, I know Geminis really can be quite into what's going on in their heads, but there's an initiative you really want to get going on, and you are almost there, but not quite. But still, the excitement is almost tangible. After all, Mercury, which is your ruler, is making a decile to Uranus. A decile to Uranus is about feeling that something is really developing in your mind. It's an idea. You're excited about it, and you feel that it could create a big change if you're able to just express it, and you want to express it now. It's almost like you want to use your willpower to just make it happen. And perhaps you take the view that just a few words, the right words, can make all the difference. You might be right, but I'm thinking that the moment might be still too early. Don't just get too excited too quickly. If you possibly can, if you can possibly restrain yourself, because with the moon is in Scorpio, Gemini, and Scorpio and Gemini are two signs that don't really have a great deal to do with each other. I'll say, both my parents were Scorpios. I'm a Gemini. Both my parents were Scorpios. My mother had 2 children on her birthday, so I got my brothers. One of my brothers is Scorpio. One of my 2 sisters is a Scorpio, and both my parents were Scorpio. So sometimes Geminis can't avoid Scorpios, but with the moon in Scorpio, it's important to be focused and to be disciplined, and I think to prepare. I think preparation is going to be important. It's not just preparing the material details. It's actually being emotionally prepared as well. So that is perhaps something you should be thinking about today, and not feeling that you actually have to take a big initiative. I think that can wait. Cancer. Now the moon is definitely in Scorpio, no doubt about it. Sort of yesterday, for some of you, moon was in Libra. Sometimes it could have been in Scorpio. It was a bit of a changeover. But today, for sure, the moon is in Scorpio. And I think from a Cancerian perspective, that is a good thing. As I said yesterday, Scorpio is a water sign. Cancer is a water sign. And you're helped, I think, by the fact that the full moon, although it's very strong today, I know we have Sun in Taurus, moon in Scorpio, the full moon is losing its strength now, because it's past peak. Now, if you are in East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, then I understand that the full moon is going to be exact. It could be exact, or when is it going to be exact? Depending on where you are. New Zealand, you might have to wait until lunchtime. But that's the first half of the day. But even in Australia and New Zealand, the full moon will be past its peak by this afternoon and this evening. So full moon is, for most of us, pretty much past that really intense part of the aspect. And I think from a Cancerian perspective, that may feel that some of the pressure has gone. You felt that there were lots of things you could do, but you wanted to do, but you felt you just weren't in a position to do it because there was too much going on. And I think it was the energy of that full moon. But now things are certainly easier, and you've got more room to breathe. and you've got more room to be yourself. And I really think that it is important to be yourself. And maybe one of the lessons of a full moon for Cancerians is that you have to perhaps be more independent. You can't spend your time worrying about what other people are thinking, doing, or suggesting, particularly if you're dealing with people who are essentially peripheral to your life. Peripheral people perhaps in the recent past had got in your way, but it wasn't always useful. And perhaps this full moon made you realize this, and you perhaps need to be more focused about who you listen to, who you spend your time with. And today, you are enjoying your independence, I hope, and also enjoying your creative independence. And I think you have an opportunity to stabilize something. Stabilize your own abilities, perhaps. We all have abilities, and Cancerians are very imaginative, they can be very artistic, and ability on its own doesn't really amount to much. It needs to be stabilized. And today, I really think that's something you can do. It's, putting something on a firm footing. It's not just about today. It's able to sustain itself over the next few days and weeks. And I think that you're going to be helped by the growing influence of a trine aspect between the moon and Saturn. So moon is your ruler of Cancer. Saturn represents stability. Okay, it can be a difficult planet, but when it's in trine, it's more likely to be a positive rather than a negative influence. And so, you can stabilize things, you can streamline things, and at the same time, you can start to take into account broader realities, maybe of a spiritual nature. So if you have some spiritual inkling, some thought about where you're supposed to be going, could be philosophical. I mean, I doubt very much you're an atheist if you're listening to me. Atheists don't tend to watch astrology videos, do they? But it needn't be about spirituality. It can be about something philosophical. But you can ground something and you can make it real. And that's perhaps something you should be focusing on. And while all this is going on, relationships, the important relationships, not just any relationship, but the important relationships in your life can be made more constructive and they can be stabilized. So if there's someone who you're close to and there's perhaps recently been misunderstandings or the odd difficulty, now might be a time when you can interact with this person and reach a stage where you can actually understand each other, and some of the instability, or perhaps all of the instability, can be removed, and you can put this relationship on a much firmer footing. And that's not just about today. I think it could be tomorrow as well, especially if you're in Asia, Australia and New Zealand. Leo, you do actually have quite a lot to say. You've got things to say that are useful, though maybe you don't think you've got anything to say. I mean, this full moon can weigh Leo's down quite a bit. I mean, Leo is a fixed sign. You've got moon is in a fixed sign, opposition to the sun, which is in a fixed sign. Yeah, this full moon can weigh you down, and you might think, well, now is not the time to say anything or to be overly enthusiastic or optimistic. Well, if that's your view, I would have said you're wrong on that score. I think there are some important things to say, and the things you say don't in themselves have to be particularly serious, considered and meaningful. It's enough, Leo, to just be enthusiastic. Be enthusiastic about what other people are trying to achieve. Be enthusiastic about what you're trying to achieve. Focus on the positives. Don't focus too much on the negatives, on why you might not be able to achieve everything you want to achieve. That's something you need to be constructive about. And by taking this kind of outlook, both in terms of the internal dialogue, or when you are talking to yourself about what is possible, and in the external dialogue, when you're talking to other people about what is possible, yes, it is very important to be positive and to consider, of all the possible things that can happen, to focus on what is the optimum outcome. I think actually that is a definition of optimism. So really try to do that. At first it might feel difficult and you might be wondering why you're doing it, but keep going. Those words that might feel a bit phony will eventually strike home. At the same time, do look beyond your immediate world. Try to look to a world beyond that immediacy, because the sun, which is your ruler, is decile Neptune. So with Sun decile Neptune, you have an idea, you have a vision, and it's a vision that I think that you are struggling to actualize, but the vision is real, or at least it's real enough. Okay, we shouldn't just chase our visions just for the sake of it. A lot of people do that and they get themselves into trouble. The vision has to be tested. You have to see what part of the vision works, what part of the vision doesn't work. After all, we've got a full moon. The full moon is about the truth. And when you perhaps start to express your vision, you get feedback, and the vision may change before your eyes. And what seemed to be a fantasy can become a reality. Perhaps the fantastic and unreal aspects of a vision will fall away, and you'll be left with a kernel of truth, and that can move you forward over the next few weeks. Virgo. Things are starting to happen, Virgo. Mercury, your ruler, is slowing down almost to a standstill, because it is about to go stationary direct. And Mercury is your ruler, and when we're trying to understand what's happening in the Virgo world, we really do have to look at what Mercury is doing. It may feel that something is on hold, but soon enough it will no longer be on hold. And it may be, Virgo, that over the last few weeks you've made a lot of discoveries. You've realized a lot of things, and it's starting to make sense. At least you feel that it's starting to make sense, but you haven't got all the way there. There are still things to work out, and maybe that's what you're working on. And with Mercury going direct, you have a chance to really put some of these realizations into practice. But for the moment, I don't think there's much that has to be done. You might feel that there's something that has to be done, because I think that some Virgos will be feeling a sense of excitement that really something is changing, that if you had been stuck in the recent past, whatever was holding you back is not as strong as it used to be, and you might then feel that now's the time to make one final push and free yourself from whatever has been restricting your freedom of action. I think that broadly speaking, you're correct in your analysis, but I think that timing is going to be quite important, and I would suggest that now might not quite be the time for taking big initiatives. Maybe you should wait, at least for Mercury to go direct. And while you're at it, Virgo, do consider other people. Other people do matter. There has been recently quite a lot of activity in Pisces, which is your opposite sign. And a lot of these planets have moved out of Pisces, over the last few months. Not so long ago, the Sun was in Pisces. Now it's in Taurus. God, time flies, doesn't it? And Mercury, not so long ago, was in Pisces. Mars is still in Pisces, though. And that's your opposite sign. And Saturn is still in Pisces. And Saturn has been in Pisces for over a year. And with Saturn in Pisces, Virgo, I think you're starting to get a good understanding of what certain key relationships are about. You understand how certain people have held you back in the past, but you've also perhaps understood that some people are important. And today, or perhaps tomorrow, if you're in East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, the moon makes a trine aspect to Saturn. And this moon trine Saturn is going to allow you to make constructive sense out of certain relationships in your life. And the reason it's constructive is because I think you're going to understand what needs to be done and what needs to be said. And partly it's an emotional process. We have to remember that the moon in Scorpio, making this trine to the moon in Scorpio, making the trine to Saturn in Pisces. Did I say moon in Pisces? No, moon is definitely in Scorpio. Moon in Scorpio making a trine to Saturn in Pisces is about you starting to bring your emotions down to earth in an interpersonal way. And you understand people emotionally, and because you have that understanding, you can engage with them in a way that is constructive and where there is also mutual respect. So that is something to consider today and perhaps probably tomorrow as well. Libra. Librans are quite sociable people. They like the social world. They find the social world interesting. And very often Librans are quite interested in what makes people tick and how people change and why people change. And this process of changing people, manipulating people, which I think deep down you always find interesting, it could be quite important because at the moment, Libra, you do actually have the capacity to influence. Now, your influence is not obvious, I don't think, but behind the scenes, you are actually in a much stronger position than you realize. And if you consider the people you have to interact with today, you do understand their weaknesses and you do understand what makes them tick. And if you want them to do something, there's a good chance you can actually make them do it. You know what words to say. And it's all about perhaps being able to finish your sentence. That's often forgotten. You can be as influential as you like, but if you can't finish your sentence, then you're not going to be able to have that influence. So it's important that you're able to say your piece, and you have to have the confidence to be persuasive in your own way. And in that way, Libra, I think your power is going to increase as the day progresses. But as I said, it's not a power that is going to be immediately obvious, and perhaps that puts you in a much stronger position than you would be otherwise, because if your power is not obvious, that means that other people are not going to perceive you as a threat. So if you are a salesperson, then I think you're going to be very effective. Or if it's very important for you to change someone's mind about something, then now might be the time to do it. But you have to work in a way that feels right. Yes, the emotions are important, but also timing is important. Remember, Libra, Venus is your ruler, and it's in Aries. And with Venus in Aries, that's quite assertive. Okay, I understand that Venus in some ways doesn't work very well in Aries, but the Sun is in Taurus, so that actually does strengthen you. The Sun moving in Taurus in Taurus in some ways, because Venus is in Aries, which is the exaltation of the Sun, and Sun is in Taurus, which is a sign of Venus. So Sun and Venus are in mixed mutual reception by sign and exaltation, and that is going to strengthen Libra. It's going to make you more aware of the emotional environment, and it's going to make it easier for you to, yes, get your message across and to get people to listen to you. One thing, though, I should mention with this full moon, I think I probably mentioned it yesterday, but I should mention it again, is that this full moon is across the financial axis of your chart. And from a financial perspective, Libra, there are certain things you might start to realize that you maybe hadn't realized before. So that might be connected with your own finances and something you're doing financially that isn't right. There's a bit of a mistake. Not that I'm giving financial advice. Just remember, this video is for entertainment purposes only. But still, there's something you need to consider about the way you're handling your finances that may not be entirely correct. Or it may be that there's something that you're not considering that you should be considering. And in that sense, you can see the truth of the matter. That the full moon shines the light. Because, you look at the full moon and, there's no cloud, it's not a cloudy sky, it's this big full moon. It's in the sky. You can see it, and that full moon up there is showing you the truth about some aspects of your finances. So be open to that, and if you do start to see the truth of the matter, then at some stage, probably sooner rather than later, it might be a good idea to actually act on that truth. Scorpio. The full moon continues. I talked about the full moon yesterday. Well, there's full moon today as well. And this full moon is on the main axis of your chart. You've got moon in Scorpio, your sign, and the sun in Taurus. And the full moon is so often about truth, seeing the truth, seeing the real picture about yourself and the real picture about other people and all the many people you have to interact with. Which people can be trusted, which people are just not worth bothering with. So that Scorpio is something that you really do need to consider. And at the same time, I think that Scorpios have an opportunity to create some stability in their lives. Stability which in the past you may have felt was missing. But now you can put certain things on a more solid footing. And I don't mean that really in a boring sense. I mean, when one talks about stability, solid footing, that does sound a bit tedious. But I'm not just talking about boring things. I'm thinking about the things that inspire you. If something inspires you and continues to inspire you, you want it to be a continuous part of your life, don't you? And I think that has perhaps been an awareness that has been quite long-standing, that's been going on for over a year. And so if something inspires you, you need to stabilize it and you need to make it real. And I think today, and to an extent tomorrow, I really do believe that that is something you can do. And Scorpio, I understand that it is an emotional time, that your emotions are strong, but it's possibly a good idea not to take any one thing too seriously. Allow things to just wash over you a little. Just have some objectivity. It's about being emotional, but not becoming part of the tide. You can observe the tide. You can be buffeted by the tide, but you don't actually have to become part of the tide. You can be connected but separate. And that, I think, is what you need to do. And it also links with the fact that the moon is trine Saturn. Moon in water sign, moon in Scorpio is in a water sign, Saturn is in Pisces in a water sign. You can have a connection, but that doesn't mean that you are joined to the hip with whatever is going on. You are still in control. And I think Scorpio, that is something that is going to be very important. And you also have to be in control in terms of how you respond to the signals you are getting from the outside world, because I understand that Scorpios regard themselves as powerful people who do their own things their own way, but there is a slight vulnerability for some Scorpios to be open to persuasion. A couple of people can sort of get under your skin, and they know what levers to push or pull, and buttons get pushed, levers get pulled. Isn't that right? Anyway, they know how to manipulate you. Do be aware of that. And of course, Scorpios hate being manipulated, but there are some people that do know how to manipulate you. Maybe not some people, maybe some organizations. So that's why you don't want to get too closely involved with what's happening. Again, being connected but not being controlled by it. So you just keep a little bit of distance, Scorpio. I think that would be a really good idea. Sagittarius. With the current astrological situation, it might be a good idea if you don't get too closely involved with whatever is happening. I don't think that you really want to get involved particularly, and I think that you should trust your instincts. You have an understanding about what is happening out there. You don't have to go on fact-finding missions, because I think you have the facts at your disposal. So there's no need to look at the facts. You can just quietly review the situation and perhaps take the view that in a couple of days' time, maybe as early as tomorrow, but the day after, the situation will have changed and you will be in a better position to take the initiative. And remember also that Mercury is going retrograde, still going retrograde. It's going direct very soon. I think it's Thursday goes direct, I believe, off the top of my head. And that is a time when things can start moving, and one has, you perhaps have to ask, what might be holding you back? Well, for one thing, I don't think that other people are as constructive as they should be. And if you're working from a career perspective, whether you're running your own business or you're employed, whatever, it's just certain key people, key institutions, they're just not being very helpful. And you may be wondering, when things are going to move. Well, things are going to move. Things are going to get better. But maybe not today. And so, Sagittarius, that would be a very good reason why you shouldn't really be doing a great deal. Certainly not making new commitments and not expecting anything to happen today. Even if you appear to get signs that things are happening, you might meet people who are very excited, who are really sure that now is the moment. You can listen to their excitement, but I wouldn't get caught up in anyone else's excitement. I don't think it's going to amount to much, and short term it's just going to be hot air. So perhaps what you really should be doing is just doing all you can to create extra stability for yourself, and that I think you can do very well. So if you have a sense of what is important to you and what makes you feel comfortable, go with that sense. Continue with it. Build the foundations. Keep building the foundations. And that's not just about bricks and mortar, it's about the emotional foundation of things. And there's still a lot to think about, feel about with the moon in Scorpio, and just let this process continue. And in a day or two's time, I think you'll know that the time for a changeover, the time to take a more active role has arrived. Capricorn, you may be slightly concerned with what's happening. I mean, not in a personal sense, but it occurs to you that many people are stuck in some kind of delusion. May not even be people that you know. It just may be the world in general. You're quite practical, Capricorn, and when you see people getting stuck in a delusion, it's like people can't move on. So it's all like society can't move on as well. So a lot of people just cannot move on, and you may find that annoying. And I suppose that would be particularly annoying if you're dealing with people who can't move on. And I actually think that is the case. You like to think the best of people. You think that they're going to follow things through, that they're going to be able to apply themselves to a broader concept of where society is supposed to be going, but they're just staying where they are. And in that sense, your social life could be quite frustrating. It is a time when Capricorns are attracted to the social aspect of things. But with this full moon, you're perhaps realizing the limitations of it. That people you thought were going to be reliable, trustworthy, fun, it's not that they're being unreliable, it's just they're just being stuck. And that might bother you. But there's no need for it to bother you. It's not your problem. In fact, what's happening, Capricorn, is you're just seeing the world for what it is. And I suppose, it's just about accepting that world and working with it as far as you can. And that is certainly something you can do, because today, perhaps tomorrow, depending on your time zone, the moon is making a trine aspect to Saturn. Saturn is obviously your ruler. So with that moon trine Saturn, it is a time when you can maybe sort out the wheat from the chaff. Not everyone is useless. And the moon, from a Capricorn perspective, does have a connection with relationships, because the moon rules Cancer, your opposite sign, and so moon is making a trine to Saturn. Saturn is your ruler. And although a lot of people are stuck and are effectively pretty useless at the moment, there are certain people who you can draw them out, and you will eventually be able to get through to them, and they will listen. So don't completely give up on the world, or at least give up on the social world, because there are a couple of individuals who you can get through to, and that could make all the difference. Aquarius. I think in many respects, Aquarius, today is going to be better than yesterday. I mean, I don't think there's anything too wrong with yesterday, but I suppose the full moon was, bearing in on you. Full moon is still there, but I think from an Aquarian perspective, now the full moon is more constructive, and you're perhaps better able to maybe use the energies of the full moon. And the full moon is showing you what works, and it's showing you what doesn't work. And I think you can see that very clearly. If you've been involved in something and it's been getting results, it's clear. If you've been wasting your time, it's also clear. And that puts you in a position to make decisions. I mean, especially as the moon is making a trine to Saturn. Remember, Saturn is ruler of Aquarius. Of course, when I say that Saturn rules Aquarius, sometimes I get a comment saying Saturn does not rule Aquarius, but it's Uranus that rules Aquarius. There are strong reasons why Uranus doesn't rule Aquarius, by the way. Uranus is a transpersonal planet. It's not really connected to the mundane world down here. I mean, I'll go into this. Maybe I'll do a video about it, but I suppose it's just I don't want to get into a big argument about it. But Saturn does rule Aquarius, and Saturn is in Pisces. Moon is making a trine to Saturn, and that does allow you to work out what is useful and what is not useful, and indeed what is profitable and what is not profitable. Perhaps consider, what things in your life are working, what things in your life perhaps are bringing in money, and what things are just a dead weight. And I think today that to a great extent you can actually distinguish between the two, and I think that could be very useful. So consider what can be done, and if you're working today, that moon trine Saturn allows you to be effective within the limits that are placed upon you. There are limits, and I think you may find that a lot of people that should know better are just not firing on all cylinders. But it's a limit that's not your problem. You can only work with the hand you've been dealt. And I think overall you can work very well with whatever you've been given. And I think overall, I think that you can be quite pleased with where you're heading today, though it's just important not to have big expectations, and not to have big expectations of other people and society around you. It just could be so much better, but that's not really your problem, is it? Pisces. The moon is moving in a part of your chart which is quite inspirational, and it is a time when you need to look up rather than down. If you were to spend all your time looking down, then I don't think you'd get very far. But if you can just consider possibilities, of course you don't want to look up all the time, because I suppose if you look up all the time, you're not concentrating, you'll just trip over. So you have to be aware of certain obstacles. If there are any obstacles, It could be about something you lumber into that you just don't know the facts about it. You come across an object, you make assumptions about it, you think you understand this object, but you don't understand this object, and it trips you up, in a metaphorical sense. So yes, do keep one eye on the ground, but broadly, Pisces, it's important to look up rather than down, and to consider the possibilities that are out there. And I think right now you're better able to work out what is possible and what is not possible. You have an understanding of things that haven't worked in the past, of perhaps ideas and ways of thinking about the world that have shown themselves to be of no value whatsoever. That's certainly true. But having got that awareness, you're able to concentrate on what truly matters, on things that can sustain you over the next weeks, months, perhaps even years. And you can be very disciplined about it. And it's like trying to catch an inspiration. Today you can almost catch the inspiration. In fact, I think you can catch the inspiration. It's very subtle, but I do think that you can actually get there. And all of those thoughts and feelings that have been building up and trying to form themselves, just been so much chaos, so much deception, but it's all starting to come together now. And the inspiration is there. And yeah, you're really helped by the fact that there's this trine between the moon and Saturn. And Saturn, remember, Saturn is moving through your sign. It's been moving through your sign for over a year, but it's now moving into the last half of the sign. And you're getting so familiar with having Saturn in your sign that you're able to use that Saturn to structure and understand your world, and most importantly to catch the inspiration. And once you've caught the inspiration, then new things are possible. And don't entirely ignore what other people are saying. There are some people who seem to be quite excited about something. Now, on the surface, they may be talking nonsense, and maybe 90% of what they're saying is nonsense, but it's probably a good idea to listen, because somewhere amongst this chaotic excitement, there is a basic kernel of truth, and that's something you need to understand and take on board. And you don't have to say much about it, but it's a sign. You know, when you've got people talking crazily about something, they are responding to what is going on in the collective. Crazy people on the street babbling. That's a sign of the times. And the very fact that you can see crazy people on the streets babbling, or crazy people on the internet, whatever, what are people spewing about today? Consider it. I suppose you could argue that I'm one of these people spewing. But what are people spewing about today? Those people might not have a clue what they're spewing about, but they are actually responding to some wider collective force. And so you can use what you're picking up. Say, look, there's something going on, something under the surface. And being a Pisces, sensitive Pisces, you actually are starting to understand it. That is it for the astrology, and I now want to look at today from the perspective of the I Ching. As usual, I cast the coins and I ask the question, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching segment of this video? Just a reminder, you do not have to watch the I Ching segment of this video. If you don't want an I Ching for today, you don't want me to do your forecast, it only applies to those people who watch the segment. And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 5, which is waiting, at least according to the Wilhelm translation. We're waiting for something. We know that something has to move at some stage, but we mustn't overthink it. Very often if we're waiting for something and we're just hoping something happens, then that's enough to make sure that actually nothing happens. But I think that is maybe a rather too superficial way of looking at waiting. And an alternative view of waiting is that it's not actually about waiting. It's about the realization that at some stage we are going to have to take the initiative. And when we take the initiative, for example, from a symbolic level, crossing the river, that means that we're going to have to interact with that river, and we may get soaked to the skin crossing that river. And getting soaked to the skin is just part of that process of taking real action. If we just stay at home with our dry clothes, yes, our clothes will remain dry, but are we going to actually get anything done? No. There's a certain point at which we do have to cross the river. And I think that we are very aware of that. Now, there is a moving line, and the bottom line moves. And what the I Ching says about the bottom line is that it's about people in the meadow. They're doing their thing, and they are aware that something is happening, that maybe action is required. But the advice here is, although we know that something is happening, although we really feel that action, we should start preparing, the advice here is to do nothing. Certainly not right now. So if there's excitement, pressure that you're feeling from the outside world, you've got to start to do something. You can't just stay where you are, that you've got to cross the river. Don't do it. The time is too early. You may be panicking. It's like, people worrying about the recession, people worrying about the economy falling apart. And what some people do is they spend a lot of time preparing for collapse, and they waste all their resources preparing for the collapse. And this hexagram is very much an anti-prepper. This moving line is an anti-prepper line. It's saying, don't get obsessed with buying canned goods, firearms, getting ready for whatever global catastrophe. That's not a good idea. Be a bit more restrained. Maybe there'll be a global catastrophe one day. Well, in the end, of course, it's all going to collapse anyway and the sun will explode. But right now, don't get too obsessed about preparing for the future, particularly if that future is, you see that future in terms of some kind of catastrophe. Of course, remember also, this is an I Ching just for today. So we need to bring it down. So yes, it's always important to be prepared. And I'm not guaranteeing that thing you're worried about is not going to happen. And maybe it will happen, but maybe it won't happen quite as quickly as you think it will. And there is a real possibility of being over-prepared. And this hexagram waiting does transition, because we do have a bottom line moving, and it transitions to hexagram 48, which is the well. And the well is actually a hexagram connected to stability, about staying in one place. And this is perhaps a reminder that we do have to stay in one place, because the well is always there. We might think that the grass is greener somewhere else, but all we need is the well. The well is there to provide us with water. It's symbolic of maybe of nourishment as well, but particularly water. Dig a hole in the ground, water's there, that well is always going to provide us with drinking water. At least this well is, and I know you've got drying up aquifers and global warming and drought, but that's not what this well is talking about. It's always there. And we need to make sure that we look after that. And the well can only be damaged in two ways. It can either be damaged through neglect, or it can be damaged through carelessness. And the I Ching talks about the bowl or the bucket which you use to bring the water up. If a bucket is cracked, then of course you don't get any more water. And why would the bucket crack? Well, because you don't look after the well. So we need to perhaps stay where we are and look after our own resources. So in other words, thinking back to that previous hexagram of waiting, don't get too excited. Don't do crazy stuff, because you might think you're doing the right thing, but sometimes the right thing is actually the wrong thing. And in doing that, by thinking too much about what you should be doing, crossing the river, you may actually damage the things you have down here, have at home, the things you use all the time. Sure, if you are planning on moving because you really believe there's about to be Armageddon, then you're going to start to neglect all the things that are really important, and that includes the well. So it can be damaged through neglect. The well can also be damaged through carelessness, through careless behavior. You don't treat the well properly, or you get involved in overly dramatic initiatives and you break the bucket and you have no more access to water. So I think the overall message is count your blessings. You don't have to go rushing off thinking there's some imminent disaster. Don't over prepare, don't over exaggerate. Look after what you have, and if you look after what you have, I think that you'll be fine. Okay, so let's now go back to the astrology and consider some of the things going on historically on April the 24th. And I want to start by looking at Ireland. Now, I must make it clear, I have never been to Ireland. I studied a bit of 19th century Irish history at school, I think. Parnell and the O'Shea divorce case and Gladstone and Home Rule and all that kind of thing. But I don't really know much about Ireland. And I want to start by looking at the horoscope of the Easter rising. And I'm putting forward the hypothesis that the horoscope of the Easter rising is on Easter, I think it was Easter Monday, April the 24th, 1916, when sort of Irish nationalists, they had this sort of rebellion in Dublin. So it happened in the middle of the First World War. And this rebellion, short-term success, so the first few hours they were able to seize some buildings, but in the end the rebellion was smashed and a lot of ringleaders were executed, and it was the fact that the ringleaders were executed that actually made the rebellion successful. But I think, as I said, I'm not an expert on Irish history. It wasn't successful short term, but it was a spark. And that's why I'm thinking, even though the British were able to regain authority, which is different from in the United States. It was like the American Revolution. It was more of a continued process of the colonists launching their war of independence very quickly. So with Ireland, I believe there was a break, but it was a start. And so I just do think that one should be considering the Easter uprising as the start of Ireland. So looking at the Easter uprising chart, so I've set this for, that's when the first casualty was. So I got another Easter uprising PO. That's a post office when independence was declared at the General Post Office in Dublin, and according to RTE.ie, the independence was declared at 12:45, and the sun is in Taurus, so that kind of fits, as I've said at the beginning. Traditionally, Ireland, the Emerald Isle, green, associated with the colour Taurus, is it's a Taurean country. And the fact that the Easter uprising took place when the sun in Taurus really does fit. The death, you can see, it started in a kind of, in some ways, in quite an inauspicious way, because there you can see Mars and Saturn. There's Saturn at 11 Cancer, Mars at 16 Leo. The Mars-Saturn midpoint is about 28 degrees Cancer. So Neptune is sort of on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. The Moon is definitely on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So the Easter uprising happened with Moon opposition Neptune, really on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and the Moon would be the people. And in many respects, the revolt was a bit of a disaster. A lot of civilians were killed. I don't even know how popular the rebels were in the first instance. What made correct me if I'm wrong, and as I said, I've never been to Ireland, I've never seriously studied Irish history, but as I understand it, what made the Easter uprising successful and as a potential beginning of Ireland was the reaction of the British, the fact that they executed the people, many of the people involved in it, and obviously made them martyrs, because that's the way the British did things in those days. If you kill someone or you have a rebellion, you get executed. That's the way it is. And remember, this is the middle of the First World War, when people were executed for desertion regularly in France, and so it was the way things were done. And so it's not surprising in a way that they were the rebels were executed, but it was the death of the rebels, and so Moon on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, that allowed the rebellion to be successful. And it's not surprising when you've got a rebellion that you've got Mars opposition Uranus. Mars opposition Uranus is quite a violent opposition. It's talking about rebellion. I mean, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Mars opposition Uranus. Regulus is rising at that time that independence was declared, and Regulus is the royal star, and I would have said that was quite a good omen. When we say Regulus is rising, I'm saying that the degree of Regulus is rising. I don't know where the star itself was, but I don't know, I think Regulus would have been at about 29 Leo. Let me just check to see what the precise orb is. If fixed stars. Ascendant conjunct Regulus with an orb of 34 minutes. And of course we don't know precisely exactly what time. This is a sort of rough 12:45 Regulus rising, assuming the RTE.ie website is correct. And so the royal star, start of a new country, or at least the inspiration that starts a new country, is rising. So I think that probably is quite useful. Notice that the Pluto is in Cancer, and that tells us about the Pluto generation. Pluto in Cancer, which was during the First World War, Pluto in Cancer is about the nation, about dying for the nation. I think the best way to summarize Pluto in Cancer is, like Wilfred Owen and that poem, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and honourable to die for one's country. That's Pluto in Cancer, and it is about nationalism, and this was a period of time when nationalism was really important. People were dying in their millions for their nation, and people were concerned about nationhood. As soon as the First World War ended, you got all these countries in Eastern Europe got their independence. Like Czechoslovakia, and Poland got its independence, and you had new countries in Eastern Europe. And of course, one of the countries that was formed after the First World War is Ireland, and the Pluto in Cancer does speak for the nationalism of those involved in the rebellion, and of course the fact that they were making a huge sacrifice because many of them were executed. And it's often useful to look at the full moon or the lunation before independence happened. So the moon you can see that the moon is moving towards an opposition of the sun. No, that's the wrong one. There it is. This is the full moon previous to the Easter uprising. So this is a full moon that took place on April the 18th, 1916. And so I've set it for Dublin. And there you can see that Jupiter is exactly on the ascendant. So if you've got Jupiter on the ascendant, that's pretty good. I mean, something big is going to happen. There's a lot of optimism there, and you can see that also on the IC, Mercury conjunct Saturn. The IC is on Pluto. The midheaven axis is on the Saturn-Pluto midpoint. So there is the intensity, something building up under the surface in Ireland that the British were not aware of. And we can look at this full moon from an astrocartography perspective. So this is the moment of the full moon, and let's just create a map of Europe. Because we have to remember that in Europe, a lot of things were going on because it was the middle of the First World War. So I know that the Easter uprising was a very big deal from an Irish perspective, but from a European perspective, there was dramas all over the world. People were being killed on the battlefields in their tens of thousands. So it's kind of difficult for Ireland to perhaps stand out because there's so much else going on. But let's just look at Europe to see if there's any sense in which in which Ireland stood out for this. And there you can see that Jupiter, that yellow line, Jupiter conjunct the ascendant, was pretty much going through Dublin. And I know there was a lot of death in Europe, but I think that perhaps if you'd been looking at this astrocartography just before the Easter uprising, maybe you were advising a British government, you might say, hold on, Jupiter's conjunct the ascendant, perhaps we need to be careful, particularly if you knew that there was an independence movement. That's something that does stand out. And Saturn is opposition. Saturn's opposition the descendant. If you there's the Saturn opposition the midheaven on the IC. This red line goes through London. In other words, this is Saturn on the IC. This is the start of a process by which Britain is going to lose Ireland. And so I think that the astrocartography actually works pretty well there with the Easter uprising. Now the question is, does it work as a chart for Ireland? I haven't really looked at it, and I just wanted to look at one event which happened a few years afterwards, because I was asking a question, what is the worst thing that's happened in modern Irish history? And I saw forums. People made all sorts of suggestions. There were bombs that, the people, the Protestants in the 70s, there was, the Dublin Monaghan bombing in 1974, I think. So there are events which perhaps one does need to consider. But the first big event that some people pointed out was the assassination of Michael Collins. So Michael Collins, this was as you know, after the Civil War was I don't know, I don't know my full chronology, but he was a chairman of a provisional government of the nationalist government, and yes, that's right. He was assassinated because they had a war with Britain, and they'd agreed to have a treaty with Britain, and because they just wanted the war to end. That seems to make sense, and I believe the agreement was that Ireland would sort of accept dominion from Britain, but would accept Britain's dominion, like being in the Commonwealth or whatever, but in terms of internal policy and whatever, would be effectively independent. But there were these anti-treaty group who didn't forgive Michael Collins for doing a deal with the British, and as a result, he was assassinated. And he was assassinated near Cork, I think. And this is a chart for his assassination. And the point about this chart is the question is, does it fit with the Irish chart? If you take the Easter Rising chart as being important, how does it fit? And although we have to look at the chart in itself, okay, you've got Mars on the midheaven for his assassination, and there's new moon on Regulus. That's important, assuming RTE got the timing right. So let's now compare that with Ireland's chart. This, if we take 28 degrees Leo as being Ireland's ascendant, but when the proclamation was read outside the General Post Office, then there was a full moon. Sorry, there was a new moon, just not much more than an hour afterwards, on Regulus, right conjunct the 1916 ascendant. So having that new moon on the ascendant, and it doesn't seem to be a particularly fortunate new moon, even though it's on Regulus, it represented the killing of a leader. New moon on Regulus. So Regulus is the royal star connected with leadership, but in this case, new moon was about the death of a leader, and that new moon was exactly on the Easter Rising's ascendant. Mars, there's Mars. So Mars was at 1614 Leo during the Easter Rising, and Neptune at the time of Michael Collins's assassination was exactly on Mars. So Neptune conjunct Mars and the new moon on the ascendant, I would have thought that's quite powerful in terms of indicating that this is a chart that may be working. And look at Chiron. Chiron was at 17.3 Aries at the time of the assassination, and it was exactly conjunct the Easter Rising's Jupiter. So Chiron is about a wound. Jupiter is about perhaps how the rebellion in perhaps the vision of the Easter Rising, and Chiron on that Jupiter, that vision is wounded. I mean, this is not the way it's supposed to be. You have Michael Collins, this renowned Irish nationalist and leader. He's killed not by the British but by his own side, and that might be Chiron conjunct Jupiter. Those are a few points about the Irish chart. Sorry to be brief, but I want to just make one point, assuming it is the Irish chart. But I suppose as I'm here, I should basically make a note about what's going on in Ireland. And if this chart is valid, then the sun is at 4 Taurus. Then we should expect with Pluto moving with right now, I'm now moving forward to 2024, 2025. The Pluto is about to square Ireland's sun. That's Sun in Taurus, and Ireland's sun is square the nodal axis, and so Pluto is going to be conjunct Ireland's north node and square its sun over the next year or two. That may suggest that the next couple of years could be quite tumultuous for Ireland. Also, that ascendant, if it's true, 28 Leo, Uranus is going to be squaring the ascendant and the descendant pretty much at the same time. So this chart perhaps does need to be considered. And Pluto, by the way, I don't know, if you know about Ireland, I said I don't really know very much about Ireland. Ireland has a Pluto opposition, has moon opposition Neptune at the time of the Easter uprising. And Pluto last year went across Ireland's moon. So, and I know that things haven't been great in Ireland. There's been a lot of sort of instability, perhaps in the wake of sort of immigration and other social tensions. And Pluto has been conjunct the moon. Pluto at the end of the year will go back into Capricorn briefly. And so in a way, Pluto will be conjunct the moon and will be opposition Neptune. So this moon opposition Neptune has certainly been under pressure from Pluto. So it is possible, if this Easter uprising chart is working, but it is actually having an impact on Ireland right now. I now want to look at something else happening in the middle of the First World War, and that was the Armenian Genocide. The Armenian Genocide has a particular time. April the 24th, 1915, 8 p.m., I think, in Constantinople, which is, of course, Istanbul. And the person most associated with the Armenian Genocide is a man called Talat Pasha. And Talat Pasha, I think, ordered the arrest of a number of Armenian intellectuals. And after that, there was a genocide. I think, remember that Turkey was at war with Russia. It was perceived that many of the Armenian minority in Turkey were helping the Russians. That didn't help. But this led to a genocide, which I don't know how many people died. Certainly 7 figures, I think. And this was the beginning. In terms of what was going on in the genocide, we just have to remember that it was during the First World War. So, like with the Easter uprisings, it was generally a time of great violence overall. And likewise, Pluto in Cancer. This may be another manifestation of Pluto in Cancer. The nation, ethnic dispute. This is Pluto. Pluto in Cancer was there's Pluto on. Pluto is actually on the Aries point here at 0 degrees 27. It's sesquiquadrate Uranus, which is on the Aries point, and so Pluto on the Uranus Aries point, that is quite violent. And Pluto in Cancer is about nationalism. And millions of people were dying in Europe because of nationalism. And I suppose if you have a country, well, in Ireland, you saw the nationalism of the nationalists. In Armenia, attacking a minority because they are perceived to be running counter to the national cause, not just attacking a minority, but committing genocide against them. So that might be a really unpleasant impact of that Pluto in Cancer. And rather than just look at this chart, or I think it is important that Pluto is sesquiquadrate Saturn, I wanted to look at the person who is most responsible for the genocide, who is most perceived as being responsible. And that is the horoscope of Talat Pasha. So this is a horoscope of Talat Pasha. Don't know what time he's born, but apparently he was born on September the 1st, 1874. And Talat Pasha has a couple of things of interest. Okay, he has Saturn-Uranus opposition. So you can see that he was born at the time of, he was born 1874. The tension there, he picks up on something quite collective, that Saturn-Uranus opposition, but difficult to see how it might be personal, but he is part of it. But there's also a very wide Mars-Saturn opposition. Now, you could say a Mars-Saturn opposition, which is 12 degrees orb, is just so wide as to just not be worth bothering with. But the thing about that Mars-Saturn opposition is that if you have to consider the midpoint, and with Talat Pasha, the midpoint was at 1448 Taurus Scorpio. Now, 1448 is 45 degrees, 135 degrees from the Aries point. So he was born with the Aries point exactly on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Aries is the world at large, what you bring to the world. Mars-Saturn is about death and destruction. Adolf Hitler had Aries on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Talat Pasha had Aries on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So if you look at Talat Pasha's chart and you compare it with the genocide, you can see that there's his Mars-Saturn midpoint. We don't know where his moon is, but his moon may be at 15 Taurus exactly, but it probably isn't because we don't know his time of birth. But his midpoint is at 15 Taurus, and that means he had Uranus square his Aries point, and he had Pluto semi-square his Aries point. Okay, not exactly on the day, but that Uranus-Pluto sesquiquadrate was hitting his Aries point, and his Aries point was on his Mars-Saturn midpoint. And so that collective energy of Saturn sesquiquadrate Pluto was activating. Not Saturn sesquiquadrate Pluto. Uranus sesquiquadrate Pluto. That collective energy of Uranus sesquiquadrate Pluto was hitting his Aries point. His Aries point was on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And that's why I think one of the reasons why he did what he did, why he was primarily responsible for the Armenian Genocide. Of course, there were other people involved. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't have been there, but I think there is a personal connection there with the Armenian Genocide, and Talat Pasha is certainly the person who is most connected with it. And like Hitler, he had the Aries point aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And did he come to trial? I think he was tried, but he was murdered or assassinated in Berlin, Germany, in the early 20s. So that's the Armenian Genocide. Finally, I want to look at the horoscope of Paula Yates. You might have not heard of Paula Yates. I think if you would have heard of her if you're from Britain or Ireland or Australia, maybe in the US, you haven't the reason you might have put her in Australia is, of course, she was involved with Michael Hutchence, who was, I think, an Australian singer. I think I've got that right. And so this is the horoscope of Paula Yates, and it would be her birthday. She'd be 65 today. And she, as I said, there was a paternity issue here with Paula Yates, because she thought that her husband, I believe she thought her father was one person, this man called Jess Yates, And then it later transpired that her husband was not sorry her husband sorry her father she thought her father was Jess Yates, and then suddenly she finds that, or the world finds, not just her, the whole country finds that her father was actually Huey Green. And Huey Green at the time in 2000, or he died in 1997, but in the 1990s people still remembered him. And you could see the paternity issue with Sun in Taurus, and in her Placidus fourth house, opposition Neptune. So Sun opposition Neptune, you could connect that with Paula Yates having paternity issues and not knowing who her father was, and until very late in life. I mean, she died when I think she discovered in late, she died, I don't know, she died in the 2000s, she was 41 when she died. And she was born on with a full moon, and moon in Taurus. Okay, it was separating to some extent, but you can see she had Sun in Taurus. That's perhaps the stability that she's craving, but she doesn't get. And there's moon in Scorpio, sort of opposition to Sun. I mean, she had quite a few relationships. She appeared to be something of a, puella eterna. Wasn't really acting her age. She was apparently. Who am I to judge? But she gave the impression of being sort of pretty promiscuous and not being particularly responsible. Yes, she married Bob Geldof, but I don't think was faithful to him, and so she had this life that was unsettled. And I think that it all perhaps links with her confused paternity, and the fact that that Sun in Taurus is completely undermined by that Neptune opposition Scorpio. And those are the main. I'm sure they're not the main features of her chart, but I haven't got much time to go into details about it. I think that when she died in 2000, I looked on Wikipedia. She was right in the middle of writing a book, and I think the provisional title of the book was something like Sex and Death. That's what she wanted to write a book about. So it's kind of not surprising that someone wants to write a book called something like Sex and Death. I don't know if I've got the title exactly right. Who's born just after a full moon in Scorpio. And indeed, that full moon would have been 1959 would have been pretty much on this kind of this full moon would have been around 2 degrees Scorpio that moon happened. So a really difficult full moon. So we always need to look at the prenatal full moon. And I did want to consider finally the chart of her death. I don't know what time she died exactly. I think so. Her death chart. This is her chart. I've actually gone for noon. I think it would have been. I think that's not right. I think I'm just going to change the death chart a bit. I'm just going to make it. We don't know. I think that's when her body was discovered. So I'm just going to provisionally. I don't provisionally go for midnight. I just couldn't spend the time trying to research when she died. But I know it was September the 17th, 2021. So that's when she died. Approximately. And I just want to compare this chart with her chart. So this in a wheel, we've got Paula Yates's chart. Outer wheel is the chart of she died. How did she die? She died of a heroin overdose. She apparently snorted heroin. It was not a particularly large amount of heroin. She hadn't apparently touched heroin for some time before that, so she was naive. Her body had not had any immunity to it. If she had been an addict, the amount that she had taken wouldn't have killed her. But she apparently snorted, and I think they found a £5 note close to her. And it was a disaster. And she was left with, I think I think it was, she was. Anyway, I don't want. You can look it up. But she died. She died of a heroin overdose, and this is the chart for the overdose. So, the chart for her dying. There are a couple of interesting things about it. She died with Venus on the midheaven. You think that Venus on the midheaven would be quite a good transit, but if I take her midheaven at 19 Libra, she died when Venus crossed her midheaven. I suppose Venus on the midheaven does push you into the public light, but I suppose you don't really want to be pushed into the public light because you've just died of a heroin overdose. She died in Notting Hill in London, and there is her Venus at 10 Gemini, 1043 Gemini. So Pluto was opposition her Venus, and in fact, she died on a Jupiter. She died very close to a Pluto opposition Jupiter. So there was Pluto opposition Jupiter in the sky, and the Pluto opposition Jupiter was hitting her Venus, and at the same time, the Saturn had just gone into was in very early Gemini. So Saturn was starting to move to an opposition of her Jupiter, and if you look at Mars, in fact, here we have, you see, she was born with a Jupiter-Pluto square, and she died on a Jupiter-Pluto opposition. And if you look at that Jupiter-Pluto square, Mars and Saturn, Mars was squaring her Jupiter, and Saturn was opposition her Jupiter, and there was a Mars-Saturn square in the sky, so the Mars-Saturn midpoint was aspecting her Jupiter. So we can see, but in terms of her death, there was a lot of stuff going on, and just a reminder, we shouldn't necessarily regard Venus on the midheaven as being fortunate. And that's Paula Yates. She would be 65 today, so I suppose one wishes her a happy birthday wherever she is. And that's all I'm going to say for today. I hope you found that of some interest, even though my subject matter wasn't always particularly happy and fun. But I think there just seemed to be a lot going on today, a lot of anniversaries, and I did want to talk about some of those anniversaries. So thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it, and if you're not subscribed and you enjoyed it, then of course I would be grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. So thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.